Ethnic cleansing is often seen as a tragedy that happens far from American soil. Massacres like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, or the ongoing Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. We Americans might shake our heads and point fingers at these countries, but we're not immune to these atrocities. In the late 1800s, thousands of Native American children, some as young as 5 years old, were taken from their homes and forced into boarding schools. Not only were they separated from their parents and tribes, but they were stripped of their native identities and languages. And this wasn't just about assimilation. It was an organized attempt to systematically erase indigenous culture.
It was considered sort of a bloodless response to the quote-unquote Indian problem in the United States, which was their interference with westward expansion. And the thought was through various assimilative policies that would make it easier, and that is to take away their heritage and their language.
That's Annette Pember, a citizen of the Red Cliff Ojibwe tribe and a national correspondent for ICT News, formerly known as Indian Country Today. She's also the author of Medicine River, a story of survival and the legacy of Indian boarding schools. In her book, she uncovers how these schools were the first step of a larger plan.
Sending Native students to boarding schools was preceded by other far-reaching assimilationist policies like Indian removal from their lands and allotment, which was the goal was to create private landowners. And what it ended up doing was really separating Native peoples from their ability to survive and feed their families, and arguably, had a greater impact than any of the other assimilationist-style policies.
The boarding school policy wasn't a blip in history. It lasted for 150 years. Together, the federal government and the Catholic Church ran over 400 of these schools across the country and housed tens of thousands of Native children. Official reports estimate that about 1,000 children died and were buried on school grounds. However, Pember and other Native Americans argue that this number is far larger, pushing into the tens of thousands. The common causes for death were starvation, tuberculosis, and broken hearts. One of the first federal boarding schools was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Former Civil War Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt founded it in 1879. His motto was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This principle was adopted across the entire boarding school system. The barbaric practices of this system resulted in long-lasting generational trauma that still has an effect today. Pember's mother, Bernice, entered an Indian boarding school at age 5.
My mother would tell me about her life at the boarding school on the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin. And the school was St. Mary's Catholic Indian Boarding School that was run by a Franciscan order of nuns called the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. And people in the reservation called it the Sister School. My mother told me the Sister School stories from my earliest memory, and always somehow embedded in the telling was the expectation that I would write about it and I would tell the world about her experience and, as a path towards redemption.
The children spent their days doing chores and were typically given very little to eat. Pember says her mother recalls always being hungry.
My mother often told me about the Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, who was pretty brutal in her discipline. And she did recall one time seeing a beautiful apple down in the cellar, and she took it and ate it and just received a terrible beating as a result. But Sister Catherine was uniquely brutal in her discipline of the children, and the kids really feared her and hated her. And my mother would often tell me a story about one Christmas season when Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, fell down the cellar steps and basically, hit her head and died. And she would say to me, "Oh, what a secret cheer us children did. It was the best Christmas gift we ever got."
Growing up, Pember never knew whether these family stories were completely true. Now, as an investigative reporter, she spent many hours verifying these first-hand accounts. To do so, she traveled to the archival library at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where many of these records live.
I was looking at the records for St. Mary's Indian boarding school, and I happened upon a administrative correspondence between the sister secretary of St. Mary's School and the commissioner at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, at the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C. And the letter to the commissioner says, well, by the time you receive this letter, our sister Catherine will likely have met her maker.
The letter continued with details of Sister Catherine's death, the same story Pember heard from her mother.
So I was alone in this big reading room at Marquette University at the Rayner Collection, and I stood straight up out of my chair when I read that. It was kind of like my family's personal smoking gun, validating everything I'd been told as a child.
Looking back, Pember's own childhood was scarred from the trauma her mom endured as a child. Her mom had severe depression and often wasn't present and available to be the parent she needed. It wasn't until she was older that this anger turned into understanding and forgiveness. Another big moment of forgiveness was last October when former President Joe Biden formally apologized for the U.S. government's role in the Indian boarding school system.
His apology was straight up, as the President of the United States, he apologized. But since I was kind of looking at some other stuff and noticed that the link to that apology on the White House website is gone. And I did inquire among several agencies, what's up with this apology? Are you guys not sorry anymore? Or what do you have to say about it? And I didn't get any response from anybody. And I contacted several people within the White House, within President Trump's press folks, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of the Interior. I even reached out to the Office of Army Cemeteries, which oversees Carlisle.
Pember says that despite the removal of the U.S. government's apology from the White House website, nothing can erase what Biden's words meant to her people.
I think for Native folks, they heard the apology. It was a sincere apology from President Biden. At least President Trump has not officially stood up and taken it back. It's just sort of gone, in this Orwellian kind of method that he seems to be operating his presidency. But I think that we still see it as an apology, and I think people are going forward with that thought.
Today, there's the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, a national nonprofit which continues to address the ongoing trauma caused by this period. Mary Annette Pember's book, Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools, is available now online and can be requested through your local bookstore. To find out more about our guest this week, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.